Hi, welcome to the channel. I'm Christopher, and today I'll be going over the most brutal and unexpected animal attacks ever recorded. From a man whose own lion suddenly turned on him on the most important morning of his life, to a man who wrestled crocodiles for breakfast, undone by a creature that spends most of its life buried in sand. It was August 3rd, 2016, during one of the driest summers Northern California had seen in years. And when conditions get like that, wildlife starts showing up in places you don't usually expect, closer to farms, homes, anywhere they can find food or water. Arjun Mehta, 52, was a software engineer from San Jose, visiting his cousin's mountain farm for the first time in years. He'd spent most of his life in urban environments, far removed from anything like this. Growing up in India, he'd heard stories from his grandfather about driving off leopards and tigers, stories about courage, about protecting your home. And I think those stories stuck with him more than he realized. Because sometimes, when you've heard something enough, it starts to feel like something you could do too. The night before everything happened, a mountain lion had killed several chickens from his cousin's coop. The signs were clear: tracks, scattered feathers, the kind of damage that pointed to a large predator. His cousin already had a plan: move the remaining chickens, contact wildlife officials, handle it the right way. But Arjun didn't like the idea of just waiting, and I get it. Nobody wants to feel like they're just letting something dangerous hang around. But at the same time, there's a difference between wanting to help and actually knowing how to handle the situation. Arjun started thinking of the mountain lion as just a bigger version of the animals from the stories he grew up hearing. Something that could be scared off with enough confidence, which isn't really how it works. He spent the day coming up with what he thought was a solid plan. Nothing complicated, just positioning himself near the house with rocks, ready to scare the animal away if it came back. And I don't know, this is one of those moments where it feels like things are being oversimplified, like treating a wild predator as if it's going to react the way you expect it to. That evening, just before sunset, he saw it. The mountain lion had returned, moving quietly near the chicken coop. This could have been the moment to stay inside, call for help, let someone trained deal with it. Instead, Arjun rushed outside. He grabbed a handful of stones, shouting as he moved toward the animal, throwing them in its direction. In his mind, it probably felt like he was taking control of the situation, doing exactly what those old stories described. But this wasn't the same situation. The mountain lion wasn't out in the open, with room to escape. It was near the barn, with limited space behind it, and without realizing it, Arjun kept moving forward. That's the part that really changes everything. Because now, instead of scaring the animal away, he was cutting off its escape route. The mountain lion didn't run, it turned. And when a predator like that feels cornered, it doesn't hesitate. The attack was immediate. The lion launched forward, covering the distance in seconds and knocking Arjun to the ground. During the struggle, it used its hind claws, powerful, sharp, built for gripping and tearing, and struck his upper thigh. The injury was severe. Arjun tried to fight back, but there was no real way to defend against that kind of speed and force. The entire encounter lasted only a few minutes. Then, the mountain lion disengaged and fled. By the time Arjun's cousin came looking for him about 30 minutes later, he was already on the ground behind the barn. The wounds had caused catastrophic damage, including a severed femoral artery, leading to rapid blood loss. Emergency services were called, but there was nothing that could be done. The medical examiner ruled the case an accidental death caused by a mountain lion attack, citing fatal blood loss from the injuries sustained during the encounter. Wildlife officials later tracked the animal and relocated it to a more remote area, determining that its behavior had been defensive. Reports noted that the mountain lion had been reacting to a perceived threat after being cornered. Following the incident, the farm implemented additional safety measures, including motion-activated lighting and reinforced enclosures for livestock. Local authorities also used the case to educate residents on proper wildlife response protocols. No further mountain lion incidents were reported in the area after those changes were put in place. It was September 17th, 2016, northwestern Montana. Black Rock Canyon Trail cuts through dense forested canyon country, known for grizzly bear activity. Trees pressed in on both sides, and the creek bed below the embankment kept visibility short in every direction. Daniel Forsyth was 46. He worked as a civil engineer. Friends described him as someone who was hard to reason with once he had made up his mind. He had been hiking for over 2 decades and believed he knew how to handle himself in the backcountry. He had the gear and the experience, and he trusted both completely. Ruth Forsyth was 44. She worked as a primary school teacher. She had been married to Daniel for 18 years, and the last 14 months had been the hardest. They had stopped talking the way they used to. Small disagreements dragged on longer than they should. Daniel had pulled away from her, and the more she tried to close the distance, the further he went. She had started to wonder whether what they had could still be saved. The trip was her idea. She suggested the trail, and he agreed almost before she finished asking, faster than he had agreed to anything in over a year. That yes meant something to her. They had met on this trail 19 years earlier and got engaged a year after that at a spot just past mile marker 6, where the canyon opened up and the view down the creek stayed with you. They had come back 11 times since. I think about that a lot. She was trying to save her marriage, and that was the trail she picked. The advisory board at the trailhead was clear. Multiple grizzly bears had been confirmed active between mile markers 6 and 9. Feeding had been observed along the creek corridor below mile marker 6, where bears had been drawn to a seasonal food source in that drainage. Hikers were told to turn back at mile marker 5. The warning was current and written in plain language. Daniel read it. Ruth stood beside him and watched him do it. When he finished, she told him it said to turn back at 5. He said they had done this trail 11 times and nothing had ever happened. He had his bear spray. The place they were going was past 6, right where the canyon opened up. The exact spot where he had proposed. He wanted to get there. Ruth told him again the warning was specific. He was already walking. She had not pushed back on him in a long time, and this did not feel like the moment to start. She followed. They crossed mile marker 5 at 9:25 in the morning. The trail got narrower and the brush got thicker on both sides. The creek ran below a short embankment to their left, and the vegetation cut visibility down to just a few meters. The sounds of the canyon, birds and water and wind, faded out in the stretch between the embankment and the tree line above the trail. Neither of them noticed. Daniel caught his foot on a root and glanced down for a moment. What they could not see was that 2 adult bears had been moving through the same creek feeding corridor independently, one working below the embankment to their left and one somewhere in the tree line to the right. The trail ran straight through the middle of that corridor. By the time they entered that stretch, there was no safe distance left in any direction. The bear from the embankment came up fast and hit Daniel from the left side. The force knocked him off the trail and onto the ground. The bear was on him immediately, biting hard into his upper back and neck. Ruth heard him go down and spun toward the sound. She stumbled to the right side of the trail, screaming and calling his name, trying to see him through the brush. That movement and that noise reached the second bear before she did. It had been feeding in the tree line above the trail, and her sudden lateral movement toward it closed the distance faster than either of them could have registered. She got the bear spray up, but she was off balance and pointing the wrong way. The spray went out at the wrong angle and did not build up where it needed to before the bear reached her. It bit into her upper back and neck. She went down and did not get up. The trail went quiet again after. Rangers started a search when the couple did not come back when expected, and their car was still at the trailhead after dark. The search team crossed mile marker 5 and found Daniel and Ruth Forsyth on the trail beyond the advisory boundary. The medical examiner recorded the cause of death for both as traumatic injuries to the neck and upper spine from animal attack with associated blood loss. They were 46 and 44 years old. Post-incident findings confirmed the advisory had been accurate and specific at the time they entered the trail. Both names were in the trailhead register signed after the board had been read. The bear spray had been discharged, but the angle and distance at the time of use meant it never reached effective concentration before contact. Tracks from 2 adult grizzly bears were identified, and the disturbance patterns were consistent with separate approach directions along the same feeding corridor. No immediate removal action was deemed necessary. It was August 8th, 2015. The Pacific Ocean, approximately 40 nautical miles off Guadalupe Island, Mexico. The water was clear and the seas were flat. Conditions were calm in every direction. There was nothing between the vessel and the horizon. Richard Hargrove was 54 and worked as a property developer in Newport Beach, California, and the people who knew him well said he was the kind of man who decided he wanted something and did not stop until he had it, no matter what it cost or what anyone said. He had been on boats his whole life, chartered trips, crude passages, weekends on other people's yachts, and at some point he had decided he needed one of his own. He saved for 3 years alongside his business income and bought a $2 million sailing yacht and named it after his wife. He hired a captain with 22 years of blue water experience and 11 Baja coastal passages behind him. 6 weeks before the voyage, the captain recommended a coastal route staying within 30 nautical miles of shore and formally advised against transiting the Guadalupe aggregation zone during peak season. Richard listened to all of it and still would not change the route because the sharks were part of why he wanted to go there. The captain resigned. Richard hired a replacement with less experience and no prior operational experience in the Guadalupe aggregation zone, and he never told him what the first captain had explained. A man with 22 years walked off that boat because of this route. I genuinely cannot understand hiring his replacement and keeping that conversation to yourself. Richard's wife Carol was 51, and his son Blake was 28, and the three of them set off on what was planned as a 10-day cruise. The first few days were easy and relaxed, with good food and music on deck, and long afternoons watching the water. And Richard had been enjoying himself so much that the warning the first captain had given him had started to feel like something that belonged to a different conversation. No sharks had been sighted since they entered the aggregation zone, and the ocean looked calm and empty and safe. On the afternoon of day 4, at around 2:15, Blake decided to go in the water. The cruise was about halfway through, and he wanted to feel the open ocean before it was over, and since nothing had been spotted, he climbed down and swam away from the hull. No formal in-water safety protocol or lookout was in place. Carol stayed on deck and Richard was below, and Blake said he would be quick. At 2:23, a shark struck Blake from below in a vertical approach with no warning. Carol had been watching from the rail and waiting for him to surface when the water around him erupted. She could see him from where she stood, screaming and fighting to get back to the surface, and she screamed and called for Richard. Richard came up from below and saw Blake in the water and went over the side himself without stopping, entering the water within seconds. I have to be honest, I do not know what I would do in that moment. I would like to think I would know better. I do not think I would. Blake was still at the surface when Richard reached him, but the water around them was already heavily discolored, and Blake was still moving erratically, which kept the shark in the area. The shark had not broken off. It had already begun feeding, and it came back before Richard could get his son to the hull, returning from below the same way it had the first time. Blake went under. The blood concentration in the water by that point was significant, and Richard was directly inside it when the shark came through again. It struck him from the side with enough force to roll him under the surface. He came up once and then did not come up again. The captain sent a mayday at 2:26, and it was acknowledged within a minute, with rescue estimated at approximately 2.5 hours out. He attempted to maneuver the vessel closer to where the two men had gone under, and during that maneuver, the prop shaft seal, which the pre-voyage survey had flagged as showing early corrosion fatigue, failed under the load. Water began entering the vessel through the shaft housing. The automatic bilge pump activated, but the ingress rate exceeded its capacity within several minutes, and a secondary compartment the captain could not access or isolate began flooding. The yacht began listing to port. Carol was at the rail, trying to see what was happening in the water below. Standing on a wet deck with an increasing port list, reducing stable footing, the yacht shifted, and she had nothing firm to hold, and she went into the water. The sharks that had been drawn toward the blood and surface disturbance were still in the area. They also attacked her. She did not come back up. By 2:44, the captain transmitted an update reporting the stern was going under. He moved to the bow and held position. Rescuers reached the vessel at 4:51 and recovered him. He was the only person on board. Blake Hargrove was 28, Richard Hargrove was 54, and Carol Hargrove was 51. None of them were recovered from the water. The investigation reviewed the route selected, the resignation of the original captain, the decision to transit the Guadalupe aggregation zone during peak season without disclosing known risk factors to the replacement captain, and the deferred maintenance on the prop shaft seal identified in the pre-voyage survey. The original captain provided a statement and did not elaborate beyond the facts. The yacht was eventually salvaged, repaired, and offered at auction. It did not sell. It was renamed and added to a rental fleet. He wanted to see the sharks. He chose to be where they were. It was August 14th, 2018. The northern sector of Kruger National Park lay under a dry, colorless sky when the stillness of a routine safari drive collapsed into a sequence of impacts. Leoran Vasca, known online as Leo, was 27 and had a small following built on low-budget travel across Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. He worked intermittently as a warehouse packer in Riga, saving for trips he framed as spontaneous and unscripted. Friends said he chased moments that could drive engagement, close calls, rule bending, anything that felt raw. His content relied less on expertise and more on proximity to risk and his willingness to dismiss it. He was traveling through South Africa with two acquaintances from a backpacking forum, Darvin Ilko, 25, from Bulgaria, and Simao Carrick, 29, from Portugal. Both ran small social media pages and shared Leo's approach to filming, often pushing each other to escalate situations for better footage. None had prior safari experience. Their guide, Mandla Nkub, had over a decade in the park and a reputation for strict safety. I think it was smart of them to hire an experienced guide. But knowing how this story ends, this detail makes this incident even more infuriating. By late morning, the group had seen little beyond distant herds and scattered antelope. According to Mandla, the monotony began to affect the passengers. Leo started filming from the back seat, narrating in a mocking tone about the lack of action. Darvin and Simao contributed intermittently, adding commentary and laughter. Mandla reminded them more than once to remain seated and to keep limbs inside the vehicle, emphasizing that proximity to wildlife did not equate to safety. I commend Mandla's patience. Personally, I would have dropped the gig then and there. He said that his instructions were acknowledged, but not followed consistently. Approximately an hour into the drive, they encountered a small grouping of elephants crossing the road ahead. A large bull stood several yards apart from the others, angled toward the vehicle. African bush elephants in this region are no joke. They can exceed 10 feet at the shoulder and weigh over 13,000 pounds, with mature bulls displaying unpredictable defensive behavior when separated from herds. Behavioral cues preceding a charge often include ear spreading, head elevation, and trunk curling inward, though these signals can escalate rapidly without prolonged display. Mandla immediately reduced speed and instructed the group to remain still and quiet. The tone inside the vehicle did not change. Leo continued filming, shifting his body for a clearer angle. He leaned his upper body out through the open side of the vehicle, extending past the frame while keeping one hand braced inside. Darvin leaned toward him to capture a similar shot, both of them focusing on the bull. Mandla's voice sharpened, directing Leo to sit down immediately. The instruction was repeated twice. Leo remained partially outside the vehicle, camera held forward. The bull elephant turned fully toward the vehicle, ears extending outward, trunk curling and uncurling in short movements. Dust lifted around its feet as it shifted its weight. The distance between the animal and the Jeep was under 40 yards. Just imagining the scene feels extremely terrifying. The charge began without further warning. The elephant accelerated directly toward the front left side of the vehicle, covering the distance in seconds. Witnesses in a trailing safari truck later described a sudden plume of dust and a rapid closing of space that left no time for repositioning. Mandla attempted to accelerate and angle the vehicle away, but the loose ground and proximity of the elephant prevented any meaningful movement. The impact was immediate. The elephant struck the Jeep's front left side, crushing metal and shoving it sideways. Leo, already off balance, was thrown about 6 feet from the vehicle, landing hard on his left side as his phone slid underneath. Inside, Darvin hit the side rail head first. Simao was pinned under the shifted seat, and Mandla was forced into the steering column with his lower body trapped. The elephant reached Leo within seconds. It struck him across the torso with its trunk, driving him into the ground. As he tried to pull himself forward, it brought a forefoot down onto his lower body, pinning him completely. Considering the weight of an average elephant, there's really no escaping death after being trampled by this massive animal. The animal lifted its foot briefly and repositioned. A second downward force was applied higher along the body, compressing the chest. Movement from Leo ceased at that point. The elephant remained over him for several seconds, shifting weight and pressing down again before stepping back. Dust hung in the air, partially obscuring visibility from the trailing vehicle. Inside the Jeep, Darvin was conscious, but disoriented, with visible bleeding from the scalp and limited ability to sit upright. Simao was similarly conscious, but unable to reposition himself due to compression against the seat frame. The fact that both remained conscious was actually surprising for me. Mandla, despite a visibly dislocated shoulder, and his leg trapped beneath the dashboard, attempted repeatedly to restart the engine. He said his movements were uncoordinated and likely slowed by shock, and he was unable to regain control of the vehicle. The elephant turned its attention briefly toward the vehicle again, stepping closer before pausing. It faced the Jeep for several seconds, trunk moving across the ground near Leo's body before slowly backing away while maintaining orientation toward the disturbance. The distance increased gradually as the animal rejoined the direction of the herd. Mandla reached for the radio with his uninjured arm and initiated a call to park authorities. His transmission was fragmented, requiring multiple attempts to relay coordinates due to breath instability and pain. The trailing safari vehicle, positioned approximately 60 yards behind, had halted at the onset of the charge. Its occupants did not approach during the immediate aftermath due to the elephant's proximity. Within the disabled Jeep, Darvin's condition began to deteriorate. His responsiveness decreased, and his breathing became irregular. Simao remained intermittently conscious, but was unable to communicate clearly. Mandla continued attempting to stabilize the situation while maintaining radio contact. No one exited the vehicle. What's saddening for me is that the Rangers arrived approximately 22 minutes after the initial call. By that time, Leo showed no signs of life. Darvin had lost responsiveness during the final minutes before arrival. Simao was still alive, but unresponsive to verbal prompts and exhibiting shallow breathing. Extraction was conducted under controlled conditions once the area was confirmed clear of the elephant. All 3 victims were transported toward the nearest medical facility. Darvin was declared dead during transport after cardiac arrest approximately 10 minutes into evacuation. Simao's condition declined rapidly. He was pronounced dead shortly before arrival. Mandla was extracted alive, but with severe injuries, including a fractured leg and shoulder dislocation that limited mobility. Leo's and his friends' social media accounts remained active for several days before going silent and were eventually taken down by someone. But for me, the most frustrating part of this story isn't even who died. It's the situation of the survivor afterwards. Mandla underwent medical evaluation that confirmed long-term impairment to his leg and limited range of motion in his shoulder. He could not return to field guiding following the incident. His livelihood and future were just gone in an instant. It was June 11th, 2014, out in rural Texas, and this wasn't your typical animal setup. This was part of the underground exotic animal trade, the kind of place most people don't even realize exists until something goes wrong. And I've heard about situations like this before, people thinking they can handle animals that were never meant to be handled in the first place. Cassian Roque, 38, had been running an illegal tiger breeding operation on his 20-acre property for about 3 years. He started with 2 tigers and eventually expanded to 6 adults. And somewhere along the way, he convinced himself he understood them, which, I don't know, always feels like a dangerous mindset when you're dealing with animals that weigh hundreds of pounds and are built to kill. Cassian believed in dominance, that animals respected strength, control, authority. And over time, he got comfortable, too. Comfortable walking into their enclosures like it was just part of his routine. What made things worse was how he had them set up. In one enclosure, he kept a full-grown male tiger with a female he was trying to breed. And from what I've seen, even professionals treat that kind of situation carefully, especially around feeding time, because food changes everything. On the day things went wrong, Cassian followed his usual routine. He dragged 2 deer carcasses into the enclosure and tossed them down for the tigers. Immediately, their behavior shifted. Both animals became alert, tense, focused. The male started asserting control over one carcass, while the female moved in, testing boundaries. And this is the part where most people would step back and give them space. Cassian did the opposite. He grabbed a wooden stick, something he normally used to manage them, and walked straight into the enclosure. And I keep thinking, what made him believe this would work? Every time? Because animals aren't predictable like that, especially not when food is involved. The moment he stepped in, the situation changed. The tension between the 2 tigers redirected. Instead of competing with each other, their attention shifted toward him. Now, he wasn't the one in control. He was the disruption. Cassian started shouting, waving the stick, trying to assert dominance the way he always had. But this time, it meant nothing. The male tiger moved first. It lunged forward with full force, knocking Cassian off balance and bringing him to the ground. Before he could react, the tiger clamped onto his neck, Almost immediately, the second tiger joined in, and at that point, there was no recovering from it. Two apex predators, already heightened by food aggression, reacting purely on instinct. There's no space for control in that situation. The attack was fast. There was no chance for Cassian to retreat, no time to reach the enclosure gate, no real way to defend himself. Within moments, the injuries were fatal, and what stands out is how quickly it all shifted from routine to irreversible in seconds. The property was isolated, with no nearby neighbors close enough to hear anything. Once the attack ended, the tigers disengaged and returned to feeding, showing no continued aggression beyond that moment. The next morning, Cassian's feed supplier arrived for a scheduled delivery. That's when the scene was discovered. Cassian's body was found near the enclosure gate he never reached. The injuries were consistent with a fatal neck bite, resulting in massive blood loss. Authorities responded by securing the property and removing all 6 tigers. The animals were transferred to accredited sanctuaries, where they were evaluated and placed under proper care without further incident. The case was ruled an accidental death caused by an exotic animal attack. Investigators cited unsafe handling practices and illegal ownership as major contributing factors. The property was later dismantled, and the incident was used by wildlife officials as a case study, highlighting the risks of keeping apex predators without proper training, facilities, or legal oversight. It was March 14th, 2018, on a 340-acre private compound outside Missoula. Cold and still in the early morning. The kind of quiet that comes from being far enough from everything that no outside sound reaches the property. Dale Crawford was 54 and had built a technology infrastructure company in Seattle into something large enough that a European consortium had spent 3 years trying to buy it, with a final investor meeting scheduled for that morning. He had moved to the Montana compound a few years earlier after regulatory scrutiny around his business. The property included multiple outbuildings, one of which had been constructed without permits and was not accurately listed in property records. That outbuilding housed a 5-year-old male lion named Aries. On paper, the animal was owned by a licensed exotic exhibitor, leasing space on the property under the Animal Welfare Act. In practice, Crawford had sourced the animal through brokers and made decisions about its care. The arrangement had not been recently inspected and did not meet proper separation standards. The caretaker, Roy Morrow, had reported for weeks that the enclosure latch was degrading and misaligned, weakened further by repeated pressure from the animal. 11 days before the meeting, a replacement part was ordered. In the meantime, a secondary chain and a consumer padlock were added. No additional restrictions were put in place around the enclosure. I want to be fair. I understand that people convince themselves things are handled. This was not handled. The meeting began at 10 a.m., with participants both on-site and remote. Catering activity in the main house carried noise and food sent outward. The lion returned to the weakened latch point, applied force, and the primary latch failed. The chain held briefly before the padlock housing fractured. The gate opened. The enclosure sat about 80 meters from the main house. The lion reached the structure in under a minute and entered through a service corridor door left open for catering. Inside, it moved toward the source of sound and activity, pausing briefly at the meeting room entrance before entering. It focused on movement, reached Dale Crawford, and took him to the ground before anyone could respond. The attack was rapid and forceful. One attendee attempting to exit was seriously injured, while another escaped through a side door. Remote participants witnessed the entry before the feed cut. Roy Morrow, already nearby due to repeated checks, saw the animal move toward the house and retrieved a dart rifle. He reached the scene within minutes. Emergency services had been called, but rural response time exceeded 30 minutes. A first dart slowed the animal, and a second was required. Full immobilization took additional time. Crawford was pronounced dead at the scene. The injured attendee was airlifted to hospital. The investigation cited violations of the Animal Welfare Act and related statutes. The unlicensed structure and prior maintenance reports were noted. A civil case followed. The acquisition collapsed under a morality clause, and the animal was later transferred to an accredited sanctuary. It was July 9th, 2016, along a gravel pull-off on the Denali Highway, mile marker 118, where the asphalt gives way to raw Alaska and the tree line swallows everything that moves. Brock Marin, 34, spent most of his off time in Wasilla watching football and tinkering with small engines. The camping trip had been his girlfriend Dara's idea. She'd grown up in rural Montana and had pushed for it repeatedly. Brock had no prior camping experience, owned no outdoor gear, and had purchased the bear spray the morning they left, still in the cardboard packaging when they pitched the tent. He seems like a pushover to me. A black bear had been working the tree line adjacent to the campsite for at least 20 minutes before the incident. American black bears in interior Alaska are not the timid garbage raiders of the lower 48. Adult males in this region regularly exceed 400 pounds, sustained by dense summer foraging. They are fast over short ground, capable of 25 miles per hour across rough terrain, and when agitated, their behavior escalates with little transition between curious and aggressive. They are not naturally predatory toward humans, but they respond to sudden movement, unfamiliar scent, and perceived threat with speed that most people are cognitively unprepared to process. Dara's small mixed-breed dog, tied to a stake near the fire ring, began barking and then broke its lead. The bear gave chase. Neither Brock nor Dara retreated to their truck, which was 40 feet away. Dara moved toward the passenger door, but stopped when Brock turned toward the animal. A hiker named Petrov, camped roughly 60 yards down the pull-off with a clear sightline, later told rangers he had watched the bear circling the campsite for several minutes before the dog bolted and had been preparing to call out a warning. Brock grabbed the bear spray canister from the picnic table. He ripped off the safety clip, but instead of properly aiming it, he overhand threw the canister toward the bear like a makeshift grenade. It struck the animal near the left shoulder and dropped into the brush. At this point, as I read through the story, I'm facepalming in real time. The bear halted its pursuit of the dog. It turned toward Brock. Petrov later described a brief, unnatural stillness before it lowered its head and began advancing in a direct, steady line, closing distance with deliberate pressure before dropping fully into motion. Brock ran toward the truck, but the terrain was uneven, wet from the previous night's rain. He slipped and went down hard on his left knee within the first 10 feet. He did not get back up before the bear reached him. Dara, now inside the truck, reported hearing the impact, a sound she described to rangers as similar to something being dropped from height onto wet ground. The bear first used its forepaws, knocking Brock off balance and collapsing his left side as he fell back into the ground cover. He tried to curl away, but the animal followed immediately, switching from swats to a bite aimed at his upper torso, shaking him. The combination of force and weight did most of the damage in seconds, leaving him unable to move or respond. Petrov, who remained at distance, said the attack continued for what he estimated was between 90 seconds and 2 minutes before the bear disengaged and moved back into the brush. Brock was non-responsive before it left. Petrov activated his satellite communicator, and rangers reached the site moments later, only pronouncing death on sight. The coroner's report noted blunt force and lacerating trauma to the thoracic cavity, left arm, and neck consistent with bear attack. Cause of death was hemorrhagic shock, secondary to multiple deep lacerations and crush injury. Time of death was estimated within minutes of the attack. Wildlife officers flagged the incident under improper deterrent use. The bear was never located. I think Brock was not a reckless man. He was simply a man handed a tool he had never been shown how to use in a situation he had never been trained to assess. That gap is the tragedy here. Not stupidity, but genuine unpreparedness, treated as a minor detail, right up until it wasn't. Nico Draven was a 22-year-old psychology student from Ohio. He grew up in a pretty typical suburban environment, where the closest thing to a wild animal was something behind thick glass at a proper zoo. But he had this fascination with big cats, posters all over his dorm, hours of wildlife documentaries, reading into animal behavior. At some point, it started to shape how he saw them. Not as unpredictable predators, but as something almost understandable, maybe even approachable. And I think that's where things started to blur for him. Because watching animals on a screen is one thing. Being near one in real life is completely different. During a road trip through Oklahoma, he and his girlfriend stopped at a roadside zoo, one of those places with chain link fences, warning signs, and minimal supervision. Visitors walked around, took pictures, and kept their distance. At least, most of them did. After the facility closed, Nico convinced his girlfriend to stay a bit longer. He wanted to observe the animals without the crowd around, said it would give him a better sense of their behavior, and I get being curious. But there's a difference between observing and getting involved. When he spotted a large male lion resting near the inner enclosure, he saw something else entirely. To him, the lion didn't look threatening. It looked calm, almost lazy, like it didn't care about anything happening around it, which I think made him feel like it was safe. His girlfriend told him not to go any closer. He ignored her. Nico climbed over the 8-foot outer fence, bypassing multiple warning signs, and made his way toward the inner enclosure. And this is one of those moments where it's like there were so many chances to stop, but he kept going. The lion remained still, eyes half closed, barely reacting. And I've seen people mistake that kind of stillness before. It looks peaceful, but it's not the same as harmless. Nico stepped closer. Then he reached through the bars. The reaction was instant. The lion surged forward and grabbed his arm and shoulder, pulling him violently against the enclosure. The force alone pinned him there, leaving him no way to pull back. His screams were brief. The lion adjusted its grip and delivered a crushing bite to his neck, causing massive trauma almost immediately. The pressure from the jaws likely severed major blood vessels within seconds. The entire attack lasted only moments. By the time the lion released, the damage was already fatal. Outside the fence, his girlfriend could only watch, screaming for help, unable to reach him or do anything to stop it. Staff and emergency responders arrived shortly after, but there was nothing left to be done. Nico was found slumped against the enclosure, unresponsive, with injuries consistent with a fatal bite to the neck. The medical examiner ruled the case an accidental death caused by a lion attack, citing catastrophic vascular trauma. Investigators confirmed that Nico had deliberately bypassed multiple safety barriers. The lion's behavior was determined to be consistent with a territorial predator responding to an intrusion. Following the incident, the facility installed higher perimeter fencing and increased security measures. Local authorities also used the case to push for stricter regulations on roadside zoos. The lion remained at the facility, as officials determined it had acted within normal behavioral patterns. It was the 16th of July, 2019, Flathead National Forest, northern Montana, a trail running route through mixed forest that Kevin Marsh had used roughly 60 times. He knew where it turned, where it dipped, where the light changed through the canopy. He knew it the way you know a road you drive every week without thinking about it anymore. Kevin Marsh was 38. He worked as a trail running coach and had built a modest following through his writing. One of his most read pieces was titled Bear Country Running: How to Stay Safe. It had picked up around 4,000 views. The guidance in it was sound. Make regular vocal noise on the trail. Slow your pace near blind corners and water crossings. Do not wear headphones in known bear corridors. He had written all of it from experience, and he believed it. He wrote the guide. He believed every word of it. That morning, he put his headphones in anyway. I understand why. The week had been difficult, and he needed the distance. But the forest did not care about his week. Tuesday was his long run day. He had been dealing with a difficult week. A scheduling dispute with a client had been going back and forth for several days, and that morning it had escalated into something that was still unresolved. When he pulled into the trailhead car park, he sat in the car for a few minutes before getting out. He put his headphones in before he started running. He had not worn them on this trail before. He started at full pace. The trail passed through 2 creek crossings. Both sat inside documented high activity zones, one near a berry patch at mile 4, the other further along where the trail dipped toward the water and the vegetation closed in on both sides. These were the kinds of spots he had written about specifically. The creek noise covered approach sounds. The terrain cut sightlines to a few meters. Anyone moving fast and not making noise was invisible to the environment, and the environment was invisible to them. He passed the first creek without incident. The music was playing. His pace was steady. Somewhere near mile 4, a disturbance moved through the brush ahead of him, a brief shift. In the vegetation, then stillness. He did not register it. He kept running. The second creek crossing came up the way it always did. The trail curved left and dropped slightly before opening onto the bank. He had run this section dozens of times in every season. His pace did not change as he came around the curve. The grizzly was at the waterline with its head down, feeding. The bear may have been aware of something approaching, but not enough to identify it as a threat before the distance collapsed. The creek covered the sound of his footsteps, and the headphones covered Kevin's ears. By the time either of them had any awareness of the other, Kevin was already within roughly 10 meters and still moving at running pace. At that distance, a startled grizzly does not have time to assess, and neither does a person. The response was immediate, and there was no interval between detection and contact in which any of the options Kevin had written about could have been applied. The grizzly made contact before Kevin had fully processed what was in front of him. The force of the initial strike knocked him off the trail. The bear bit into his upper back and shoulder, and the weight behind it drove him to the ground. He had no footing to push back from, and no distance or time to draw and deploy the spray on his belt. The bear held the bite. The injuries to the upper back and neck region were immediately incapacitating. He did not get up. Kevin Marsh did not complete the run. His vehicle remained at the trailhead through the afternoon. When he did not return by early evening, someone raised the alarm and a search was initiated. The team followed his usual route into the forest. They found him near the Second Creek crossing. He was 38 years old. The cause of death was consistent with a grizzly bear encounter at close range. The investigation noted that the trail passed through a documented high-activity zone, that the creek crossing limited sound and visibility, and that Kevin had been running at full pace without making noise and with headphones in at the time of the encounter. His blog post remained online. The comments stayed open. People continued to find it through search. It was September 4th, 2006, and Steve Irwin was in chest-deep water above a sand flat at Bat Reef, about 7 miles northeast of Port Douglas in far north Queensland, Australia. The sky was clear. He was just shooting footage for a children's program. Steve Robert Irwin was born on February 22, 1962, in Upper Ferntree Gully, Victoria, the only son among 3 children born to Bob and Lynn Irwin, who operated the Beerwah Reptile and Fauna Park in Beerwah, a modest stretch of scrubland on the Sunshine Coast hinterland, about an hour north of Brisbane. Bob Irwin was a plumber by trade and a naturalist by compulsion, the kind of man who brought injured wildlife home as a matter of habit and built enclosures in the backyard on weekends. Steve grew up inside that habit. He was handed his first python, a scrub python, non-venomous, roughly 12 feet long, when he was 6 years old. By 9, he was assisting his father in the physical capture of wild freshwater crocodiles, wading into murky Queensland waterways, and wrestling animals that could remove fingers if they got the angle right. There was no performance in any of this. It was the texture of his childhood. He took formal ownership of the park in 1991 and renamed it the Australia Zoo in 1998 and began the work of transforming a regional curiosity into a major wildlife and conservation institution. And what happens to a man like that once a camera enters the picture? The Crocodile Hunter, the documentary series he began filming in the early 1990s with his wife Terry, whom he met in 1991 and married in 1992 after she visited the zoo during a crocodile demonstration, eventually broadcast in more than 130 countries and reached an estimated 500 million viewers worldwide. He held professional permits to capture and relocate saltwater crocodiles, the largest living reptile on Earth, an animal capable of exerting bite forces measured in excess of 3,700 pounds per square inch, and had done so hundreds of times in remote wilderness, under conditions that were legitimately dangerous and entirely unscripted. Every one of those captures had ended the same way. Steve Irwin walked away. He was not a showman who had adopted wildlife as his brand. He was a naturalist who had accidentally become a television personality, and the distinction was evident to every member of his crew and every scientist who had worked alongside him. By 2006, he and Terry had quietly purchased more than 330,000 acres of land across Australia, Vanuatu, Fiji, the United States, and Argentina, dedicating the acquired properties to conservation in perpetuity. He had stated publicly that the remainder of his career would be focused on lobbying against habitat destruction across Southeast Asia and Northern Australia, and he had channeled a significant portion of Australia Zoo's revenues into the land acquisition program. He was 44 years old. He was in excellent physical health. He was at the height of his professional reach, planning multiple documentary projects and preparing for a keynote appearance at a conservation summit scheduled for the following months. He worked 6 and 7 days a week without visible strain. He was, in September 2006, the most recognizable wildlife advocate on the planet, and he was precisely where he always was, in the field, in the water, with a camera, and that camera is where this story turns. The stingray Irwin and his cameraman Justin Lyons encountered that morning was large by any measure. Lyons described the animal as roughly 8 feet wide across its disc, at the upper range of what a snorkeler in shallow water might encounter, and it was about to become the most directly relevant fact about the morning. Stingrays are bottom dwellers, spending most of their time buried in sand or slowly cruising the seafloor. They have no interest in humans. Their only real weapon is the barbed spine on their tail, up to 14 inches long in large specimens, hooked like a fish hook so it tears rather than punctures cleanly on the way out, and coated in venom that causes severe pain and tissue damage beyond what the wound alone would inflict. Despite how slow and passive they normally appear, that tail can whip with enough force to drive the spine through cartilage and, in extreme cases, thin bone. The crew of the Croc 1 had been working on location in the Port Douglas area for several days as part of the early production phase of a documentary tentatively titled Ocean's Deadliest, a project focused on dangerous marine species in northern Australian waters. The production had been repeatedly disrupted by weather. The Coral Sea in early September can be inconsistent, and the original deepwater filming locations had been rendered inaccessible by chop and swell on multiple days. Weather had pushed them somewhere safer, or so it seemed. The team had been pushed into the sheltered shallows near Bat Reef to wait, which placed them in extremely calm, very shallow water that was categorically different in character from the location's ocean's deadliest, was actually designed to document. On the morning of September 4th, the conditions were ideal. The swell had settled, the sky was clear, visibility underwater was measured in dozens of feet, and the sandy flat where they were working was in places no deeper than 3 to 4 feet at low tide. The benign quality of the location was precisely the reason it had been used for supplemental surface footage on previous shoots. Irwin had entered the water not to film any segment for Ocean's Deadliest, but to collect additional footage of reef fish for Bindi the Jungle Girl, the children's wildlife program his 8-year-old daughter was hosting. It was, by every reasonable evaluation, a low-stakes shoot. He was snorkeling, not scuba diving. He had no tank, no regulator, no ability to descend and reposition below the water column. He was moving along the surface in a wetsuit with a snorkel mask, carrying no equipment of his own, staying at the surface while Lyons filmed with an underwater camera. Staying at the surface. That detail will matter in about 60 seconds. The Stingray was already present on the flat when they located it. It was moving slowly across the sand in a pattern consistent with routine foraging. No agitation, no visible alarm response, nothing that would have registered to an experienced eye as a warning. What the situation contained, without advertising it, was a particular combination of factors that the behavioral record of the species identifies retrospectively as a risk profile. An unusually large animal in water, too shallow to allow rapid downward escape, with a human being, Irwin, positioned directly above it and moving in the same direction. A stingray's primary threat response is avoidance. It dives, accelerates laterally, buries itself, or simply flees. In water 3 feet deep, with a human above and the sandy bottom below, the space available for those responses contracts. The animal cannot dive. It cannot accelerate upward through its primary threat. Its remaining option, triggered by the hydrodynamic pressure of something large and close above it, is the caudal spine. Lyons has described Irwin as hovering almost directly over the ray as it moved across the flat, maintaining close proximity to get the best possible footage angle. Standard documentary practice that had been used with stingrays on hundreds of occasions without incident. There was no history in Irwin's experience, or in the documentary filming practices of his crew, that would have identified that specific configuration as materially different from what had always been safe. There was no reason to pull back. The animal gave no visible warning that Lyons, in his account, identified as a clear precursor signal. What he described was a ray moving steadily across the bottom, and then a tail that rose. The stingray propped on its front and began stabbing wildly with its tail. Stingray defensive tail strikes are not the slow, sweeping motions of a resting animal idly moving its tail. They are rapid, targeted, and powered by the full contractile strength of a muscled tail that in an animal of this size represents a substantial percentage of total body mass. The tail drove upward in the direction directly behind and above the ray's body, which placed it precisely in the space Irwin occupied. He was in the snorkeling posture, body horizontal, face angled slightly downward toward the animal below him, torso pitched forward at the surface. That position, in that moment, presented his chest to the ascending spine at close to a perpendicular angle. The spine entered his chest in the left center thoracic region, in the anatomical territory directly overlying the heart. It did not graze him. It did not produce a shallow wound at the surface and deflected. It penetrated. The retroserrated spine passed through the skin, subcutaneous fat, and pectoral musculature and reached the pericardium, the tough, fibrous, closed sac that encases the heart, and breached it. The pericardium is not soft tissue. It is a dense, layered membrane composed of an outer fibrous layer and an inner serous layer designed to anchor the heart within the chest, limit its motion during contraction, and protect it from infection. It resists penetration. The force required to drive a stingray barb through it is considerable, and the animal delivered it. At that depth of penetration, vascular structures associated with the heart were directly in jeopardy. Blood began entering the pericardial space immediately. The structure designed to protect the heart had just become the structure that would kill him. Lyons was several feet away when it happened. He reached Irwin within seconds. What he saw in that first moment of contact was Irwin pushing the ray away, a reflexive response. The instinct of someone who has sustained a sudden, painful, penetrating wound, and whose body moves before conscious decision-making can intervene. Lyons pulled him toward the surface and began moving him toward the croc one, which was anchored close by in the shallow water. The water was only 3 feet deep, and the boat was near, but those seconds mattered in a way that could not be recovered. The crew on deck saw what was happening and moved immediately, leaning over the gunwale, reaching down, pulling, Getting Irwin out of the water took seconds. The water was shallow enough to stand in, and there were multiple crew members responding. But every second was a second in which blood was filling a space it had no exit from. What they laid on the deck was a man with a stingray spine still partially lodged in his chest, still partially encased in its integumentary sheath, the barbed tip buried in tissue above his heart, venom already beginning its enzymatic work in the wound cavity, blood already accumulating in the space where no blood should be. The spine could not safely be pulled out. The retroserrated barbs would tear additional tissue in every direction on withdrawal, accelerating hemorrhage rather than slowing it. It could not safely be left in. There was no safe option. There was only a man on a boat deck, 8 miles from shore, with a puncture above his heart and a crew standing over him. Inside his chest, a condition called hemopericardium was progressing with the speed that a laceration in or near the heart produces. Blood pouring into the pericardial sac, a closed, inelastic structure that cannot expand significantly to accommodate additional volume, begins immediately to compress the organ it is designed to protect. As the sac fills, it squeezes the heart from the outside, reducing the space available for the ventricles to expand between contractions. Diminishing the volume of blood the heart can draw in and pump out with each beat. The heart works harder against increasing resistance. Cardiac output drops. Blood pressure falls. The process is called cardiac tamponade, and in a wound of the severity Irwin had sustained, with hemorrhage originating from lacerated pericardial or cardiac vasculature, the onset of tamponade is not a matter of minutes. It is a matter of a very small number of minutes, possibly less. It cannot be reversed by any intervention available outside a surgical theater. Pressing on the wound does nothing. Removing the spine worsens the hemorrhage. CPR can maintain mechanical circulation temporarily, but cannot address the compression. The only treatment is either a long needle introduced through the chest wall into the pericardial space to evacuate blood, a procedure called pericardiocentesis, or direct surgical decompression of the chest, cutting through the sternum or ribs, opening the pericardial sac, and repairing the source of hemorrhage. Neither procedure was remotely possible on the deck of a boat on a reef flat 8 miles from the nearest road. The crew began CPR on the deck of the Croc 1 within moments of getting Irwin aboard. Someone was already on the radio. A mayday was transmitted to the Marine Rescue Coordination Network, which relayed it immediately to Queensland Ambulance Service and initiated emergency response procedures out of Port Douglas. The call went out clearly and fast. What it described, a penetrating chest wound from a stingray barb, adult male, unconscious, CPR in progress, position about 7 miles northeast of Port Douglas, was a scenario for which no prepositioned asset existed that could close that gap in the time the injury allowed. Port Douglas is a small coastal town of several thousand people at the base of the Daintree region. It has a medical clinic. It does not have a trauma center. The geography Steve Irwin had chosen to spend his life in was the same geography that now made saving him impossible. Helicopter emergency medical services operate out of Cairns, roughly 45 miles to the south, and their response time to a reef location 8 miles offshore under normal dispatch conditions is not a matter of minutes, in the way that an urban code trauma response is a matter of minutes. The Croc 1 was moving. The captain had brought the boat to its maximum speed, heading toward the coast, trying to reduce the gap between where they were and wherever help might be able to intercept them. Crew members rotated through CPR, pressing down on Irwin's chest in 30 compression cycles, tilting his head, breathing into his airway, pressing again. The mechanics of what they were doing were correct. The problem was not their technique. The problem was that the heart they were trying to support was contained within a pericardial sac that had been filling with blood since the moment the spine entered his chest, and no amount of external compression could address that. They were doing everything right. It just couldn't reach the problem. There was no AED aboard that would have helped. An AED delivers electrical current to reset a heart in ventricular fibrillation, or pulseless ventricular tachycardia, arrhythmias caused by electrical dysfunction. And Irwin's heart was not in arrhythmia from electrical dysfunction. It was in mechanical failure from external compression. The two conditions require entirely different interventions, and only one of those interventions was possible 8 miles out on a moving boat, and it was the one that wasn't going to work. Chest compressions maintain some circulation. They keep oxygenated blood moving to the brain and vital organs at a reduced fraction of normal cardiac output. They buy time. However, the wound was spending that time faster than the compressions could supply it. Irwin lost consciousness and did not regain it. The crew rushed him to the nearby low island, where medical staff pronounced him dead. He had entered the water less than an hour earlier. The Queensland coroner's findings and the account of the attending physician established the cause of death as penetrating cardiac trauma from a stingray spine. The venom delivered through the integumentary sheath contributed tissue destruction and intense pain consistent with stingray envenomation, but it was not the mechanism of death. The wound's location was the mechanism of death. A stingray spine entering the upper arm, the thigh, the foot, the anatomical sites of the overwhelming majority of documented stingray injuries, is survivable, painful, and in many cases manageable in the field. A stingray spine entering the chest directly above the heart at the angle and force involved in this strike is not. The coroner found no basis for any determination of recklessness, negligence, or preventable error. The finding was death by misadventure. Misadventure, the official word for when everything goes wrong and nobody did anything wrong. Terry Irwin was trekking in Cradle Mountain, Tasmania, when she was reached by phone with the news before any public announcement. Bindi was 8 years old. Robert was 2. The Australia Zoo continued under Terry's management and has remained operational in the years since, with both children eventually taking on public roles in wildlife work consistent with their father's mission. The conservation land purchase program their father organized continued to expand under the Wildlife Warriors Worldwide Foundation, established in his name. The public response to his death reached the scale reserved for figures who had become genuinely and widely loved, rather than simply famous, a distinction that his crew, the scientists who had worked alongside him, and the institutions that had received his conservation funding had understood for years before the rest of the world articulated it at once. Stingray fatalities in Australian waters are, by any statistical measure, extraordinarily rare. The animals produce several hundred injuries per year in Australia, nearly all of them foot and ankle wounds sustained by waders who accidentally step on buried specimens in coastal shallows. Deaths are so infrequent that they are counted in single digits across the entirety of modern Australian maritime records. Irwin had spent more than 30 years in the physical company of animals that kill people with some regularity: saltwater crocodiles that ambush and drown, taipans with neurotoxic venom that overwhelms the respiratory system, eastern brown snakes responsible for the majority of Australia's annual snakebite fatalities. He had managed every one of those relationships with a level of skill and situational awareness that had kept him alive through encounters that a layperson could not have survived. He died because a large animal in shallow water had nowhere to go. The water was 3 feet deep, the sky was clear, he was 44 years old, and he was above a stingray he had no particular reason to fear, shooting footage for a children's show. And the one variable that made the difference between that being an ordinary Monday and the worst Monday of everyone aboard the Croc 1 was the angle of 8 inches of bone. A private funeral service was held in Caloundra on September 9, 2006, 5 days after his death, attended by family and close colleagues. He was then buried in a private ceremony at Australia Zoo later that same day, in the place he had spent his life building. It was September 29, 2018, along a rainforest trail within Daintree National Park in far north Queensland, near the township of Mossman. By the time the first hikers stopped with their voice raised into the quiet canopy, the damage had already been done. Maricel Quint, known to most people as Marie, was 24 and living in Eugene, Oregon, where she worked part-time managing front desk operations at a small yoga studio while building a modest online following centered on yoga and wellness content filmed in outdoor settings. She loves bringing up the concept of being one with nature in her videos. Based on my research, she had no formal background in wildlife, no outdoor certifications, and no history of backcountry travel. Her familiarity with nature likely came from accessible viewpoints, roadside stops, and short hikes documented for social media. She had arrived in Queensland 3 days earlier on a content-focused trip planned around filming yoga sequences at scenic drives and national park landmarks. Her stated goal for the trip, based on her recent posts, was to build a set of images and clips that conveyed balance, control, and calm in remote natural landscapes. The Daintree area offered exactly that: tropical backdrops, wildlife sightings, and rainforest access points where large animals could be observed at relatively close range. Mari had rented a compact sedan in Cairns and spent her first 2 days moving between Cape Tribulation, Mossman Gorge, and several roadside viewpoints. She had seen wildlife only at a key distance: wallabies near the undergrowth and a brief sighting of a tree kangaroo across a clearing. Understandably, I think nothing in those early encounters had required her to adjust her behavior. The trail access point where the incident occurred sat along a narrow sealed road bordered by dense tropical vegetation and intermittent clearings where animals often foraged during daylight hours. Mari reached the trailhead in the early afternoon when light foot traffic had slowed and several vehicles were already parked along the gravel verge. A southern cassowary was visible near the tree line, approximately 80 feet from the road, foraging with its head angled toward the ground. Cassowaries are widely regarded as the most dangerous birds in the world. Adult southern cassowaries stand up to 6 feet tall and can weigh between 120 and 165 pounds, with powerful legs capable of delivering forward kicks of enormous force. Each foot carries a dagger-like inner claw, the cassowary's most dangerous feature, measuring up to 5 inches in length, capable of inflicting deep lacerating wounds to the torso, limbs, or neck in a single strike. I wouldn't want to be found near one. 2 occupants in a parked hatchback remained near their vehicle, watching. Another car slowed briefly before continuing past. Mari pulled in, angled her car toward the clearing, and stopped with the driver's side facing the bird. She exited quickly, leaving the door open, her phone already in her hand with the camera active. There were visible signs that should have established distance. A permanent trailhead notice warned visitors not to approach cassowaries and to maintain a minimum distance of at least 50 feet at all times. The bird itself showed early indicators, lifting its head, raising the bright wattles at its throat, and orienting its body toward her. The couple near the hatchback later told investigators that they assumed she would stop at the edge of the verge, but instead, she stepped off the packed gravel onto uneven ground, closing the distance to roughly 60 feet. She raised her phone, seemingly adjusting her position for a tighter frame. The cassowary turned fully to face her, casque tilting slightly forward. The nearby witnesses began calling out loudly, a short, repeated signal. Mari glanced back briefly and lifted one hand in a dismissive gesture before returning her attention to the animal. She moved closer again, stepping onto a shallow slope where loose gravel transitioned to leaf litter. The distance narrowed to approximately 25 to 30 feet. The bird's posture shifted further, neck extended, body lowered slightly, legs set in a more rigid stance. It took several short, advancing steps toward her, closing a small portion of the distance, while maintaining its forward orientation. The calling increased in frequency. A passing hiker slowed and then stopped behind the couple, observing the scene. Mari adjusted her stance and raised her phone higher, positioning it as if preparing to frame herself with the cassowary behind her. It's really infuriating how she ignored all the warning signs. The charge began after a brief forward advance of several feet, the bird accelerating suddenly into a sprint. Mari reacted late, pivoting to run back toward the pavement. Her footing failed on the loose leaf litter. Her right foot slipped on the uneven slope, and she fell onto her side, impacting the ground with her shoulder and hip. She attempted to push herself upright, but the bird closed the remaining distance almost immediately. The first contact came from a forward kick, the inner claw raking across her upper abdomen and lower chest in a fast, upward motion. The force drove her flat against the ground. The impact produced a visible jolt through her body, after which her movements became less coordinated. She rolled partially onto her side, bringing her arms inward toward her head. The cassowary stepped past her and turned back toward her position, creating a brief gap of a few feet before re-engaging. The cassowary repositioned again, stepping laterally and then forward, delivering one more forceful forward kick that struck across her midsection in a broad, tearing motion. The inner claw caught briefly against her clothing and body before the leg retracted as the bird shifted its weight. The movement rotated her onto her back. Her legs extended outward without coordinated motion. Her attempts to move decreased noticeably after this point. At this point, the couple near the hatchback was shouting continuously. One was on the phone with emergency services, providing location details and reporting an active wildlife attack. The other moved closer to the road edge, waving their arms and calling out in an attempt to distract the animal. The cassowary remained focused for several seconds more, standing near her position with its head lowered, then stepped back, pivoted, and moved at a steady pace toward the tree. Line. Mari lay near the edge of the trailhead, partially on the gravel, partially on the leaf litter. There was minimal visible movement. The witnesses were instructed by emergency services to remain at a safe distance due to the risk of the cassowary returning. Considering the circumstances, I think it's commendable that they did what they could to try and save her. The call to emergency services was logged during the attack. Wildlife officers and paramedics were dispatched immediately. The first response unit arrived approximately 20 minutes after the initial call. During that interval, no one approached the victim. The cassowary did not return to the immediate area, but remained within the surrounding vegetation, according to later observation by wildlife staff. Upon arrival, responders assessed the scene for wildlife presence before approaching. Mari was unresponsive. There were multiple visible injuries across the torso and upper body. Paramedics initiated assessment procedures, but identified no signs of sustained responsiveness. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Based on the coroner's report, the cause of Mari's death was penetrating and blunt force trauma consistent with cassowary attack. Primary injuries included multiple deep lacerations to the torso, severe chest trauma, a collapsed lung, and internal hemorrhage from claw strikes. Additional trauma to the shoulder and pelvic regions was noted. The report concluded that the injuries were severe and life-threatening, with survival dependent on rapid medical intervention. The area was temporarily closed following the incident. Wildlife officers monitored the cassowary and surrounding zone for several days, noting continued normal foraging behavior consistent with established territorial patterns. No removal of the animal was carried out. Advisory signage was increased along the roadway, emphasizing minimum viewing distances and the extreme risk of approaching cassowaries under any circumstances. Mari's social media accounts were taken offline approximately 1 week later at the request of her family. Local coverage of the incident remained limited, appearing primarily in regional reports focused on wildlife safety. The trailhead where the attack occurred reopened after a brief closure, with additional warnings posted at the site. Overall, I think this was a good call, but I don't think it would stop other influencers from attempting to take selfies with a cassowary. It was June 14, 2016, outside Cody, Wyoming, where the Absaroka Range cuts into the sky like broken teeth and the wind carries the smell of pine and something older. The kind of country that doesn't negotiate. Evan James Mallory, 31, worked IT support for a mid-sized logistics company in Boise, Idaho. He was the guy who fixed your printer and quietly resented it. What gave him purpose was the Pacific Northwest LARP community, where he played a druid named Calden Moore, the Patient. He was respected in that world, a scene coordinator, a lore keeper, someone people listened to. He'd driven 9 hours to attend the Renaissance Fair near Cody with his girlfriend, Priya Nath. The fair was incidental. For Evan, the Absaroka backcountry was the real draw. Priya later said that he'd mentioned more than once that getting into character meant getting into nature. The trail they took climbed a sagebrush slope above the Shoshone River basin, opening into a subalpine clearing roughly 2 miles from the trailhead. Grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem are not rare. Population estimates in 2016 placed over 700 animals in the region. Adult males average 400 to 600 pounds and can sprint 35 miles per hour. Their charge response can be triggered by sudden arm movement, direct eye contact, or perceived advance into their space. Bears in early summer are calorie deficient after hibernation, which elevates aggression. A trail information board at the trailhead posted an active bear warning. Recent grizzly sightings within a mile of the area. A ranger had also verbally flagged it to fair attendees that morning. Priya later told investigators she remembered seeing the sign. She also said Evan had pointed up the ridge and said something to the effect that the bear was far enough and that he wanted to see how close he could get before it moved off. He carried bear spray clipped to his satchel. She stayed back. Evan moved upslope toward the ridge. The bear, an adult male, was roughly 80 yards out, but already moving along the tree line and slowly closing distance toward the same drainage, feeding and drifting between brush patches. By the time Evan stopped, the space between them had narrowed to about 40 yards, with the bear now fully aware of their presence. Evan raised his staff with one arm extended wide, a gesture pulled from his LARP lexicon, meant to signal peaceful intent. The sudden arm movement likely contributed to the bear's shift in attention. The bear stopped feeding. What happened next took under 6 seconds. The grizzly dropped its head and came straight downhill. Evan reached behind his back for the bear spray. The wind was blowing toward him at roughly 10 miles per hour. He discharged the canister only when the bear had closed to roughly 25 feet. The spray blew back directly into his face at close range. He went down immediately, partially blinded and choking. The staff fell. The bear did not slow. The first contact knocked Evan backward onto the slope. The bear bit into his left shoulder and shook, dislocating the joint and fracturing the clavicle before shifting its attention higher toward his head. Priya ran downhill screaming. A day hiker lower on the trail heard her and called 911. Terrain delayed emergency response to approximately 32 minutes. Mallory was pronounced dead at the scene by rescue personnel after a brief field assessment. Within the LARP community, Evan's death prompted a brief wave of posts and tribute sessions where participants shared memories of his character work and coordination efforts. An in-character memorial event was held in his honor, but the discussion surrounding the incident quickly shifted toward safety boundaries. In outdoor roleplay settings, I don't mock Evan Mallory. He was someone who built meaning through imagination, and that's not a character flaw, but imagination has no authority over 500 pounds of bear. The costume, the staff, the gesture, none of it meant anything to the animal coming down that ridge. It never does. It was July 22nd, 2016, right in the middle of a Florida summer, and if you've ever heard anything about Florida, you already know the wildlife doesn't exactly chill out during this time. If anything, it gets more active, more aggressive. So hearing that a group of guys decided to camp near a remote canal at night, yeah, that already sounds like the start of a bad idea. Kian Vasquez was 28, a construction worker who had just moved to Tampa from Arizona about 6 months earlier. And I kinda get it. If you grow up somewhere dry, where the most dangerous thing you deal with is maybe a rattlesnake, it's easy to underestimate how different Florida is. But still, I feel like at some point you'd at least ask someone, right? Especially when locals literally treat certain areas like no-go zones after dark. Kian had this reputation for being fearless, but honestly, it sounds more like he just didn't know where the line was. You know those people who always take things one step further than everyone else, just to prove they can? Yeah, that kind of energy. That night, he and a group of co-workers had just wrapped up a long week and decided to camp near one of these canals. They'd been drinking for hours, and you can probably already imagine how the mood shifted. Jokes getting louder, dares getting thrown around, people trying to outdo each other. Then someone spots a pair of glowing red eyes in the water, and I don't know about you, but that's the exact moment I'm calling it a night. No hesitation. But instead, it turns into a challenge. Who's brave enough to get closer? Kian takes it personally. He starts talking about how he's not afraid of any reptile, brushing it off like it's nothing. At first, his friends are laughing, but you can tell it slowly turns into concern when he actually starts taking off his clothes and stepping toward the water. He strips down to his boxers and walks straight into the canal. Almost immediately, the alligator strikes. No warning, no buildup, just pure speed. It lunges from the darkness, clamps onto his upper thigh, and starts a death roll. It's violent, disorienting, and over in seconds. Then, just as quickly, it lets go, which honestly feels like the only lucky break he got that entire night. The noise from the shoreline probably scared it off, and Kian manages to stumble back out of the water. He's bleeding, clearly injured, but he's conscious, alive. His friends rush in, drag him out, panicking, but also probably thinking the worst is over. And here's where things take a turn that's honestly more frustrating than the attack itself. Because Kian starts joking. He downplays it, acts like it's not a big deal, like he just got lucky, and that's the end of it. He wraps his leg in a dirty shirt and insists he doesn't need a hospital. His friends tell him to get medical help. He refuses. And I keep thinking, was it pride, embarrassment, not wanting to admit he took it too far? Because that one decision, that's really what sealed everything. Over the next couple of days, his condition gets worse. The swelling increases, the skin changes color, the pain intensifies. What probably looked like just a bite starts turning into something way more serious. Infections from alligator bites are no joke. The bacteria in their mouths can spread fast, and in his case, it turns into severe cellulitis. By day 3, it's already bad. By day 4, it's critical. The infection enters his bloodstream, and he develops sepsis, his body basically going into full system failure trying to fight it off. He collapses in his apartment, and by the time paramedics arrive, there's nothing they can do. The medical examiner later confirmed it. Septic shock from an untreated alligator bite. And what really sticks with me here is how preventable it was. Antibiotics, proper wound care, even just going to the hospital that same night could have changed everything. It was August 3rd, 2015, Route National Forest, Colorado, a dispersed backcountry campsite in mixed forest terrain known for black bear activity. The kind of site experienced campers find without much effort, quiet, off the main routes. the sort of place that feels familiar the moment you set up. Gary Tipton was 45. He worked as a high school geography teacher in Pueblo, Colorado. He had been car camping for years and had completed 40 trips across 11 states before this one. He had never used proper food storage methods on any of them. No bear hang, no bear box. No separation between food and sleeping area. Nothing had ever happened. 40 trips and not a single problem. That record was the most important thing he carried into every campsite. 11 states, not one problem. I want to be honest. If I had that record, I might start to think the same way he did. That is what makes this case so easy to understand and so difficult to watch unfold. This campsite had a bear box. It was a 10-minute walk from where he pitched his tent. He noted it when he arrived and did not use it. He cooked bacon at 6 in the evening. The high-fat cooking residue moved through the trees the way it does, heavy and far-reaching. He cooked again at 10 at night, a late meal before bed. He left the residue on the stove where it sat. Before he got into his sleeping bag, he applied scented lip balm and placed his food bag in the tent vestibule, the covered outer section of the tent, separated from where he was sleeping by a single layer of tent fabric. His hiking partner was camped roughly 30 meters away. The partner had hung their food using a proper PCT hang, suspending it well away from the sleeping area with no food odors left near the tent. The two camps sat in the same forest that night under different conditions. Bears navigate by scent. They can detect food odors across distances that would surprise most people, and they move toward the strongest source with focus and consistency. What Gary had built over the course of that evening was a layered scent trail, pointing in a single direction, high-fat cooking residue twice over, grease on the stove, an unsecured food bag at the entrance to his tent, separated from him by fabric alone, scented product applied directly to his face. Each element on its own would have been enough to draw interest. Together, they created a continuous gradient, pointing straight at where he was sleeping. The bear entered the campsite sometime in the night following that gradient. It did not remain at the partner's hang. There was nothing there to compete with the stronger source nearby. It continued along the scent trail until it reached Gary's tent. It pushed into the vestibule and began pulling at the food bag. The noise woke Gary. He moved inside the tent, disoriented and in the dark. And as the bear breached the vestibule, the barrier between them collapsed into immediate contact. The bear reacted to the sudden presence with a short defensive burst, biting into his face and upper chest and swiping hard before disengaging. The contact lasted only a few seconds, but the injuries to his face, neck, and chest were severe. The noise brought other campers out of their sleep. They emerged from their tents shouting and banging whatever they could find, moving toward Gary's campsite with torches. The bear registered the disturbance and moved back into the tree line. The campers reached Gary and found him on the ground outside the torn tent, bleeding heavily from his face, neck, and chest. They applied pressure to the wounds and tried to keep him still. He was conscious for a short time, enough to register that people were with him, and then lost consciousness before he could give a clear response. His condition deteriorated steadily from that point. The injuries were too extensive, and the bleeding too heavy for field treatment to hold. Someone called emergency services. The campsite was remote, and the hour was late, and it took time for paramedics to reach them. When they arrived, they worked on Gary at the scene, but he had already succumbed to his injuries before evacuation could begin. Gary Tipton was pronounced dead at the campsite. The cause of death was recorded as severe traumatic injuries and blood loss consistent with a bear attack at close range inside a tent. Post-incident findings confirmed the food storage guidelines had not been followed, despite a bear box being available at the site. Evening had created a concentrated scent environment at the sleeping location. The partner's use of proper food hang protocols was noted in the review. The bear had followed the only thing that had been made consistent. The partner 30 meters away followed the protocols. The bear walked straight past their camp. Gary's record of 40 trips without incident ended on trip 41. That breaks my heart. It was September 3rd, 2016, in a narrow open ocean corridor between Cuba and southern Florida, and the GPS marker that 214 people had been tracking throughout the day began to drift irregularly before stabilizing again. Renata Call, 44, was a claims adjuster from Tallahassee who specialized in liability documentation, turning incidents into structured reports based on probability and evidence. Outside of work, she was part of a small endurance swimming community and documented long-distance crossings in plain, factual notes. She had completed multiple supported ocean swims with a kayak escort and a trailing vessel operating under standard open water safety protocols. Her daughter Mira, 16, lived in Pensacola with her father. They had not spoken regularly for nearly a year. In her last public post before the attempt, Renata wrote, "Whatever happens in that water is mine." The route she followed crossed a deep ocean channel influenced by the Loop Current, where warm water moves between the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic. The area is biologically active, with migratory fish and occasional pelagic species passing through, and conditions can shift quickly, especially at night when visibility drops and surface reference points disappear. From the research I did on this corridor specifically, the Loop Current isn't just a navigation challenge. It actively pulls drift patterns in directions that are genuinely hard to model in real time. Her support system included a kayak escort and a trailing vessel maintaining GPS tracking and periodic radio contact. During daylight, coordination remained stable with steady pace and predictable drift. As evening set in, conditions gradually worsened. A low cloud layer reduced horizon visibility, surface glare faded, and slightly increased swell intermittently disrupted line of sight between support units. Radio communication became less frequent as spacing widened during minor course adjustments. Renata maintained a steady rhythm, with tracking data showing consistent movement, but subtle drift corrections suggesting fatigue. The escort kayak adjusted position, but remained at distance, while the support vessel briefly moved out of visual range during a navigation correction. At this stage, Renata was effectively isolated in a wide field of dark water, with only intermittent visual contact possible between units. No distress signals were transmitted, and her stroke pattern remained stable. A sudden disruption occurred at the surface level. The kayak operator reported a brief disturbance in the water ahead, followed by a loss of clear visual reference due to darkness and swell interference. From the vessel, the swimmer's position remained visible on GPS, but visual confirmation was no longer possible. Moments later, the swimmer's movement became irregular, with brief changes in heading and speed consistent with a struggle to regain balance in the water. The kayak moved to close distance, but visibility and spacing delayed immediate confirmation of what had occurred. Seconds matter differently in open water at night. There's no margin for delayed confirmation. Within a short interval, the tracking signal showed a separation event, with the swim harness detaching and drifting independently at the surface. The GPS continued transmitting briefly, recording a stationary point before shifting with surface current movement. At that point, both escort units initiated emergency protocols and broadcast distress alerts. Search coordination began using last known coordinates, drift modeling, and surface current projections. However, reduced visibility and separation between units slowed immediate localization. Search and rescue recovered only detached tracking equipment, with no swimmer located in the immediate drift zone. Expanded surface searches yielded no further contact. The operation continued under standard missing person protocols before being suspended after an extended period. The case was classified as an open water disappearance during an endurance swim, with cause of death listed as undetermined due to no recovered remains. Manner of incident: accidental at sea. Review findings cited environmental separation, reduced visibility, widening escort spacing, and delayed loss of contact recognition as primary factors. Ocean conditions were noted as capable of rapid drift dispersion in low visibility settings. No confirmed wildlife involvement was established. Tracking data briefly circulated within endurance circles before removal at family request. Internal reviews focused on communication timing and escort coordination gaps. The event was later referenced in safety discussions on long-distance open water swims under variable conditions and limited support coverage. I don't see this as something caused by a single factor. From my perspective, it came down to a convergence of distance, reduced visibility, and a breakdown in spatial coordination between support units in open water. It was October 8, 2017, along the Northern California coast, and this wasn't just any normal surf day. This was peak season for great white sharks, the time of year when the water basically turns into an active hunting ground. That stretch of coastline had seen a surge in elephant seal populations, which meant one thing: great whites weren't just passing through, they were staying there to hunt. Soren Arlo, 31, was a freelance graphic designer from San Francisco who had been surfing for about 5 years. decent experience, but not exactly someone you'd expect to handle high-risk conditions. And this is where things start to feel a bit too predictable. That weekend, he met a marine biology student at a coffee shop. They talked, and she mentioned she'd be at a nearby beach doing research the next morning. And I think this might have been the moment things shifted for him. You know when someone suddenly feels like they have something to prove? Soren shows up early the next day. The beach is mostly empty, except for a small research team, and there are warning signs posted around the area. Recent shark sightings, increased activity, all of it clearly laid out. And it wasn't just signs. The marine biology student actually spoke to him directly. She explained what was going on, that sharks had been actively feeding near the shoreline because of the seal colony, and told him it wasn't safe to go into the water. At that point, it's hard to ignore. Like, you're not guessing anymore. You're being told straight up. But Soren brushes it off. He claims he surfed similar conditions before, which from what we know wasn't really true. And I've seen this kind of overconfidence before. It's like people feel the need to live up to an image instead of just being honest about their limits. Because realistically, nothing would have happened if he just stayed on shore. Instead, he paddles out. And not just anywhere, he positions himself directly over the seal feeding zone, the exact spot researchers had already identified as the highest risk. Which makes me think, was he even processing what he'd just been told? The attack happens without warning. A great white shark comes from below and strikes with full force, mistaking his silhouette for a seal. One powerful bite to the upper thigh, and it severs his femoral artery instantly. Soren manages to scream once before falling off his board, the water around him quickly turning dark with blood. On shore, the research team reacts immediately. They shout warnings, call emergency services, and attempt to paddle out toward him. But the distance and how fast everything happened made any real rescue impossible. The shark releases after the initial bite, which is typical behavior once they realize it's not their usual prey. The water settles almost as quickly as it erupted. Emergency responders arrived shortly after and recovered Soren's body 3 hours later, still tethered to his surfboard by the ankle leash. The bite had caused catastrophic damage to his femoral artery, leading to rapid blood loss within minutes. The medical examiner ruled the case an accidental death caused by a shark attack, citing fatal blood loss and subsequent drowning. Statements from the research team, including their direct warnings to Soren, were included in the official investigation. Following the incident, the beach implemented stricter safety measures, including mandatory advisories and increased monitoring during periods of heightened shark activity. It was September 3rd, 2014, at the Brașov Regional Zoo in central Romania, and the maintenance lights along the Eastern Animal Corridor had been flickering for 3 days. Minor fault no one had gotten around to fixing, in a zoo where minor faults had a habit of becoming something worse. Elena Varga was 26, unemployed for 8 months, and had spent most of that time online. She had grown up in Cluj-Napoca, the daughter of a retired school teacher, and had briefly studied veterinary medicine before withdrawing in her second year. People who knew her described her as passionate and sincere, but increasingly isolated. Her social media activity in the months before September showed a fixation on captive animal welfare, particularly on Mika, a 9-year-old Eurasian brown bear housed at the Brașov facility. Elena had posted repeatedly that Mika's enclosure was too small, that his repetitive pacing was proof of psychological collapse, and that the zoo was willfully ignoring his deterioration. The Brașov Regional Zoo sat at the edge of a forested hillside, its older enclosures built to 1970s Eastern European standards, functional, minimal, not designed with modern safety redundancies in mind. Mika was a male Eurasian brown bear, standing roughly 6.5 feet tall on his hind legs, and weighing an estimated 520 pounds. They are not aggressive by default, but they are profoundly territorial, and a confined bear with no outlet for flight behavior will default to confrontation when that territory is breached. Elena arrived at the zoo after closing, sometime around 8:40 p.m. She had brought a commercial bear spray canister, a deterrent product designed to temporarily incapacitate bears at a distance, not kill them. However, she claimed in an online post that in sufficient quantity, it could be used humanely to euthanize an animal. This is medically and chemically false. She accessed the facility through an unsecured maintenance gate on the eastern perimeter, a known weak point that had been flagged in an internal safety memo 6 weeks earlier and had not been addressed. A keeper named Andrei Florescu was conducting a late equipment check in the service corridor adjacent to the bear enclosure when he saw Elena drop down from the interior gate lip and land inside the paddock. He triggered the enclosure alarm immediately and began shouting at her through the fence. Elena did not leave. Mika, who had been resting near the far wall, oriented toward her within seconds of her landing. He did not charge immediately. He stood, watched, and began to move in a low, deliberate walk that experienced handlers recognize as threat assessment. Elena raised the bear spray and discharged it. The enclosure's partial roof and internal ventilation created a lateral draft that pushed the cloud sideways and away from the bear. Mika continued forward. She discharged the canister a second time. It produced a short, weakened burst and was likely affected by short standoff distance and enclosure airflow disrupting dispersion. Effectiveness. Poor aim combined with unstable airflow, reducing any meaningful cloud formation or coverage. She was now without any effective deterrent, and approximately 15 feet from a 520-pound animal that had closed more than half the distance between them. Mika struck her with a downward swipe to the left shoulder that dropped her to the ground and fractured her clavicle and 2 ribs simultaneously. What followed was a rapid and chaotic series of bites, pushing, and crushing body weight. He pinned her with his body mass, and the injuries sustained to her skull, neck, and thoracic cavity in the following short interval of under 2 minutes were unsurvivable. Andre called emergency services from outside the fence while using a metal feed pole to strike the outer barrier and create noise. Response teams arrived 18 minutes later. Access delays through the zoo's locked secondary corridors pushed intervention to 26 minutes total. They could only declare Elena dead at the scene. In the weeks following, Romanian animal rights groups split sharply, some framing Elena as a martyr to captive animal welfare, others refusing to eulogize someone whose actions got an animal nearly killed. I think it's sad to think that Elena genuinely believed she was saving something. That belief was not grounded in any reality Mika was capable of understanding, and it cost her everything while changing nothing for him. It was October 24th, 2014, in the Avindo Basin Rainforest concession in Gabon, where the canopy blocked most direct light, and dense Marantaceae undergrowth reduced visibility to only a few meters along narrow trails. Raymond Kowalski was 71 and had retired from a long career as a civil engineer in Fresno, California, with enough money saved to spend the rest of his life doing the thing he had always made time for. He had been hunting across Africa for decades and had 3 volumes of detailed journals to show for it: elephant in Zimbabwe and Tanzania, lion in Zambia, rhino in the era before the ban made that impossible. The concession was licensed, and the hunt was led by professional hunter Etienne Bro, who carried a .458 Lot. Kowalski chose a 12-gauge shotgun with slugs instead of the recommended rifle caliber. They moved single file along an elephant trail, with vegetation on both sides limiting movement and sightlines. Before entering a tighter section, Brault advised turning back due to poor visibility and unsafe conditions. Kowalski disagreed and chose to continue. Brault noted his objection formally, and they continued. He wrote it down before they walked in. At approximately 9:40 a.m., the trail curved sharply, reducing visibility further. A group of forest elephants was already just beyond the bend, including a calf. Detection and contact occurred almost simultaneously. The nearest female reacted immediately and charged. Forest elephants charge without extended warning when surprised at close range, especially with a calf present. At that distance, a defensive response is immediate. She came without further signal. The distance closed in seconds. Brault attempted to raise his rifle, but the vegetation blocked his movement. The elephant struck him first, knocking him into the undergrowth. Kowalski had no clear firing lane and discharged one slug. It hit, but did not stop the charge. The elephant reached him at speed, knocking him down and trampling him as it moved through the confined trail. The force caused fatal injuries on contact. Brault recovered, retrieved his rifle, and fired to drive the elephants off. The group withdrew into the forest. Kowalski was unresponsive. Brault confirmed no signs of life, marked the location, and moved the body slightly off the trail before withdrawing to reach radio contact. Recovery was completed later that day with additional personnel due to terrain constraints. He was pronounced dead at the site. The cause of death was blunt force trauma and crush injuries consistent with a close-range elephant charge. The review found the incident consistent with a defensive reaction in low visibility conditions, and Brault's prior objection was included in the record. Raymond Kowalski's remains were repatriated to the United States through consular channels. It was October 12th, 2023, and by late morning, the stretch of sand had emptied out to almost nothing. A few tire tracks from an early surf check, a crushed aluminum can near the dune grass, and the steady movement of low gray swells under an overcast sky. Darlene Osueke, 61, had worked the serving line at a public school district for over 2 decades. She was known for remembering which students needed extra portions without being told, and for staying a few minutes late to clean equipment others left behind. That detail stopped me cold. The kind of person who does that quietly, without recognition, that matters. The work was repetitive and physically demanding, and over time it had taken a toll on her joints. By 2021, she had undergone a partial knee replacement that did not fully restore mobility. She continued to experience swelling in her left leg and reduced stability on uneven ground, with body weight and post-surgical limitations further affecting balance and endurance. Medical records indicated a body weight of approximately 344 pounds, which, combined with post-surgical limitations, affected balance, endurance, and movement in unstable surf conditions. Her doctor recommended low-impact activity to support circulation and edema management, such as pool exercise. Instead, she continued her routine of returning each October to a quiet stretch of coastline where she would sit, rest, and wade slowly into the water without swimming. That morning, water temperature was in the low 70s, with limited visibility due to runoff from a nearby tidal system, creating a murky near-shore environment. In such coastal conditions, large sharks, like bull sharks, may occasionally move through while following natural prey patterns, though encounters with humans remain rare and generally unpredictable. A small family that had been in the water earlier eventually left, and the beach grew quiet. A jogger passed along the shoreline, noting Darlene standing waist-deep in the water before continuing on. Before entering, she had removed her sandals and a compression sleeve from her left calf, which had been managing a minor chronic wound. In surf zone conditions, minor injuries are not considered a reliable attractant for marine predators. Movement and environmental disturbance are far more significant factors. Darlene moved gradually farther out, reaching chest depth. She walked parallel to shore, with slow, controlled steps, using water buoyancy to reduce joint strain, though wave motion and uneven footing reduced stability. A large shark made brief contact with her lower left leg in a single bite and release event, followed by additional close-range contact in the same area, resulting in a more forceful injury to the same limb. The animal remained in the immediate vicinity briefly, then moved away. Within a short interval, additional contact occurred in close proximity, producing a more forceful injury to the same limb, resulting in near-complete traumatic amputation of the left lower extremity, with major vascular disruption and uncontrolled hemorrhage. Believe me, I've covered a lot of these cases. The clinical language in the reports never makes it easier to process what it actually describes. Darlene struggled to maintain balance in the water as blood loss and instability progressed, making controlled movement toward shore increasingly difficult. The disturbance was noticed by the jogger, who had turned back along the shoreline. What initially appeared as irregular splashing became a distress situation as he approached. No further marine contact occurred as she reached progressively shallower water, and the animal was not observed again. By the time assistance reached her, she was near the shoreline. She was pulled onto wet sand, where bystanders applied direct pressure and improvised a tourniquet using available clothing while emergency services were contacted. First responders arrived shortly after dispatch and initiated hemorrhage control and stabilization on scene. Following assessment of injury severity, air evacuation was requested for transport to a regional trauma center for definitive care. Medical documentation later described severe traumatic injury to the left lower extremity, consistent with near-complete traumatic amputation and extensive vascular and soft tissue destruction, with suspected involvement of major lower limb arteries. Despite rapid intervention, she was pronounced deceased later that day due to exsanguination. It's not something that comes down to one single decision. In conditions like murky water, reduced visibility, and being relatively isolated, even small limitations in awareness or reaction time can quickly compound. In coastal environments, careful judgment and situational awareness can reduce risk, but they can't remove it entirely. It was the 18th of June, 2017, Bridger Teton National Forest, Wyoming. Open alpine terrain, broken up by patches of mixed forest and brush, grizzly bear country, the kind of landscape where you can see a long way in some directions, and nothing at all in others, depending on where the vegetation closes in. Philip Crane was 43. He worked as a high school science teacher in Casper. He had been hiking recreationally for years, and had recently completed a wilderness safety course that included bear encounter protocols. He had come away from it confident and well prepared, or at least that was how it felt. He was leading a small group that day and had explained bear behavior at the trailhead before they set out. Let me be fair here. He had just completed a wilderness safety course, but what the course could not prepare him for was what his own body would do in the half second after the first charge stopped. The bear appeared at a distance, open stretch of trail, and began moving toward them. Philip told the group to hold, and they held. The bear came fast, closing the gap in a rush, then stopped somewhere in the range of 10 to 20 meters out. It looked like a bluff charge, close enough to what he had read about that he held his position and did not run. The first phase had gone roughly the way the training described. Not perfectly, but close, enough that he was still standing. Then the tension broke. The adrenaline that had been building through the charge released all at once, and something involuntary came out of him. A short, sharp sound, somewhere between a shout and a laugh. The kind of thing a body produces when it has been braced for impact, and the impact does not arrive. It lasted less than a second. He had not chosen to make it. The bear was already highly aroused from the charge, already at close range, already in the middle of an assessment that had not been resolved. The vocalization may have contributed to what followed, but the bear was already operating at a level of stress and proximity where very little was needed to tip the interaction. What caused the second charge to begin cannot be stated with certainty. What is clear is that it followed almost immediately. The distance was already gone. The bear came to the remaining ground without stopping. The group behind Philip broke and ran when the second charge began. The bear remained fixed on Philip at the closest point. Philip was the nearest target, and the bear reached him. The bear hit Philip and drove him to the ground. It bit into his upper back and shoulder, and the force was immediate and significant. He tried to cover his neck with his arms, but the bear's weight pinned him, and the biting continued across his back and the back of his head before the bear disengaged and moved off. Philip lay on the ground and did not get up. The rest of the group reached the trailhead and reported the encounter. A search response was initiated, and a team followed the trail back into the area. Philip Crane was located near the encounter site. He was alive but severely injured, with deep lacerations and bite wounds across his upper back, shoulders, and the back of his head. He was airlifted to hospital, where he underwent surgery. He survived, but sustained permanent damage to his shoulder and partial hearing loss on one side from the head injuries. Post-incident review noted that Philip had followed correct bear encounter protocol through the first charge. The involuntary vocalization at close range during the assessment phase was identified as a possible contributing factor to the escalation, but reviewers noted the bear had already been in a highly aroused state at reduced distance, and that the interaction may have escalated regardless. The review noted that the group breaking and running during the second charge did not redirect the bear. No fault was identified with the trail operation or the terrain. The bear was not located for removal assessment. The plan accounted for behavior. It was September 19th, 2015, deep in the wilderness of Montana, and this was one of those seasons where grizzly bear activity was higher than usual. The kind of time when experienced hunters start being extra cautious, not less. Because out there, you're not at the top of the food chain. Gideon Rusk, 45, was a bow hunter from Colorado with over 20 years of experience. And not just casual experience, he was serious about it. The kind of guy who invested heavily in his gear. Custom bows, premium. Optics, specialized equipment, everything top tier. I've seen people like this before, where the gear isn't just equipment, it's almost personal. Like losing it would feel worse than it probably should. Gideon had spent close to $8,000 on this hunting trip, and part of that included a set of limited edition arrows he'd been talking about for months. So when things didn't go as planned, he took it harder than most would. During the hunt, he spotted a large bull elk and took his shot, but it wasn't clean. The arrow struck poorly, and the elk bolted into thick brush, disappearing into dense cover with one of those expensive arrows still lodged in its body. And I get it, missing a shot like that probably feels frustrating, maybe even embarrassing, but this is where things start to shift. His hunting partner immediately noticed warning signs: fresh grizzly scat, claw marks on nearby trees, disturbed ground. All clear indicators that a bear had been in the area recently. And from what I've heard, that's usually your cue to back off, especially when visibility is low and you're dealing with wounded prey. But Gideon couldn't let it go. His partner warned him not to go in. Gideon went anyway. He convinced himself he could move quickly, grab the arrow, and get out. In his mind, it probably felt controlled, manageable. But the moment he stepped into that brush, everything changed. The visibility dropped almost instantly. Thick vegetation, limited sight lines. You're basically moving blind at that point, and instead of scanning ahead, Gideon was focused on the ground, following the blood trail. What he didn't realize was that something else had already found the elk, a grizzly bear, and not just passing through, it had claimed the elk as a food source, which makes this situation even worse, because now it's not just about crossing paths with a predator, it's about walking into something it's actively protecting. When Gideon pushed through the brush and entered the clearing, he walked straight into it. No warning, no time to react. The bear charged immediately, and this is the part people underestimate, how fast they move. There's no buildup, no chance to think things through. 1 second it's there, the next, it's on you. Gideon barely had time to register what was happening before the grizzly closed the distance. The impact knocked him to the ground, and within seconds, the bear delivered a crushing bite to his head and neck. The force alone was catastrophic. His hunting partner, about 250 yards away, heard the noise, shouting, crashing brush, then silence. He started yelling, banging equipment together, trying to scare the bear off, but it was already over. The entire encounter lasted less than a minute. By the time his partner reached the scene, Gideon was lying near the elk carcass, unresponsive. The injuries were severe. His cervical spine and trachea had been crushed, causing immediate death. The arrow he had gone in to retrieve was still lodged in the elk, exactly where the bear had been feeding. Wildlife officials later investigated and determined the bear had acted defensively while protecting its food source, which is standard behavior in that situation. Due to the fatal nature of the attack, the bear was located and euthanized in accordance with wildlife management protocols. The case was ruled an accidental death resulting from a wildlife encounter. Investigators noted that entering an active feeding site significantly increased the risk of a defensive attack. The outfitter involved in the trip later reinforced safety guidelines, emphasizing that no equipment should be retrieved under those conditions. It was September 3rd, 2016, in the Western Carpathian Mountains of Romania. A continuous stretch of beech forest running roughly 40 kilometers in every direction from the NGO research camp. High brown bear density, no fencing, no perimeter lighting, and the nearest ranger station, several hours away, by road. Stefan Varga was 39 and had left a private equity partnership in Budapest with enough money to pursue wildlife photography independently. He had applied 3 times to the NGO carnivore program before being accepted, and a substantial donation around the time of the 3rd application likely helped. He arrived with high-end equipment and a working method he was not prepared to adjust. Lena Brandt was 33, a graphic designer from Leipzig who had joined him for the final 10 days. She had no field background. On her 2nd day, she asked a technician about bear spray. The technician recommended it. Varga rejected the suggestion and described deterrence as a false dependency that compromised the authenticity of his work. The spray stayed in the vehicle. She asked the right question on day 2. A trained technician backed her up. Varga overruled both of them. I keep thinking about what that conversation felt like for her. His permit had expired on September 1st. He had extended the stay to the 6th and arranged private transport via charter and ground transfer from a regional airfield approximately 2 hours away. The NGO had not sanctioned the extension. He had been tracking an adult male bear, 12 to 14 years old, with a notch in its left ear, naming it in his field notes and treating it as a subject rather than a hazard. He had been placing food at 3 deposit points, roughly 60 meters from camp, positioned to guide the animal through his primary camera angle. The sites were outside routine monitoring paths, in terrain dense enough that increased activity near camp was not immediately obvious. The NGO staff did not know. Lena did and objected. Varga described it as controlled methodology. It was a low-mast year, natural food was limited, and bears were ranging closer to human areas than usual. 2 days before the incident, the same bear had approached within 15 meters of camp and remained for 11 minutes. Varga recorded the encounter as non-threatening. Lena asked to leave. He told her one more day. On the morning of September 3rd, in low early light under the canopy, the bear approached silently and held position near the camp for several minutes, posture consistent with assessment of a known food source. It then moved directly toward the structure. Varga was outside. Lena was inside the tent. A bear conditioned to a feeding location does not approach it cautiously. It returns with expectation. The repeated deposits had established that association. The bear engaged the canvas with forelimb force, tearing through it and collapsing the frame. It entered the structure. Lena had no space to move or create distance. The attack was immediate and focused. It did not break off. Varga moved away from the structure. The bear did not pursue him immediately, but after remaining at the site, it followed the next available movement. Without a deterrent and in dense terrain, he was unable to make it far. The camp missed its scheduled check-in at 7:15. Concern was raised late morning, and rangers were contacted around 9:20, arriving in the early afternoon. The tent was partially destroyed from the outside. Lena Brandt's remains were found within the collapsed structure. Stefan Varga was located approximately 70 to 100 meters into the forest, partially covered with leaf litter and debris. The adult male bear with the notched left ear was identified at the site and euthanized during the recovery operation. It was October 6th, 2013, in the foothills west of Sundre, Alberta. The elk rut was winding down. The bears were gorging before denning, and somewhere in the timber above the Clearwater drainage, a woman who had walked these hills for 20 years was about to discover that experience offers no guarantees. Martha Ellery was 42, a part-time hunting guide operating out of Sundre, who spent the other half of her year working dispatch for a wildlife management contractor. She carried bear spray on every trip, drilled her clients on what to do if things went sideways, and had a reputation among local outfitters for being methodical and unsentimental. This particular October trip was a 5-day ungulate hunt with 3 paying clients from Ontario, 2 brothers and a colleague. None of them unfamiliar with the bush, but none of them familiar with this country. The foothills west of Sundre compress into long, timbered ridges, broken by creek drainages, choked with willow and buffalo berry shrub, exactly the habitat a grizzly bear uses in the weeks before freeze-up. Grizzly bears in late hyperphagia are not the same animals encountered in early summer. A sow with cubs in October has spent months accumulating fat reserves and is operating under a level of defensive aggression that has no equivalent among North American wildlife. Martha had received an advisory the week before. Grizzly activity was elevated in the Sundre foothills, with 2 livestock kills within 12 kilometers of her route. She noted it, but didn't change plans. Her clients had come from Ontario, and the weather window was narrow, typical trade-offs that usually don't matter. On the morning of the 6th, the group moved through dense willows along a creek when one brother stopped to glass uphill. The wind shifted and swirled. Martha kept about 20 feet of spacing and used quiet voice checks in the thick cover, but the sow was already at close range, partially hidden and closing fast. Her cubs broke upslope. No bluff or warning. She was committed and covered the distance instantly. Martha had the spray off her hip in under 2 seconds. She deployed a full burst directly into the animal's path, and witnesses behind her saw the cloud expand forward, then drift left as the wind shifted again. The sow hit the spray cloud at an oblique angle, taking partial exposure across her muzzle and left eye, but she did not stop. She covered the remaining distance and struck Martha across the upper chest and left shoulder with her right forepaw, dropping her immediately onto her back. The impact was audible to the client standing behind her at a greater distance. Contact was forceful and immediate. The sow struck high with a forepaw, impacting Martha across the upper chest and left shoulder, driving her backward to the ground. As Martha fell, the bear followed through, pinning her with body weight and delivering a bite to the left arm, clamping above the elbow and shaking in a short, violent motion, consistent with a neutralizing response. Martha rolled partially onto her front under the force, and the sow shifted her grip, placing her jaws at the back of the neck and base of the skull. Witnesses described a single, sustained bite with downward pressure before release. The bear disengaged abruptly after that contact, lifting off and moving laterally back into the willows rather than pursuing further. The cubs were no longer visible, and the sow's retreat path aligned with where they had fled moments earlier. One client reached the radio and raised emergency dispatch, while the other 2 pulled Martha onto higher ground. Response teams arrived by off-road vehicle in 33 minutes. Martha was unconscious and had lost significant blood volume. She died before the evacuation reached the paved road. The coroner's report noted blunt force trauma to the thorax, bilateral rib fractures, severe lacerations and crush injury to the left arm, and a fatal compression fracture to the cervical spine at C2, consistent with a large predator's bite grip. Martha Ellery knew about grizzly country. She respected it. The wind shifted and moved through the drainage in ways that could not be fully predicted, and it scares me to think none of that preparation was enough. It was June 14th, 2015, on a rented stretch of private beach outside Nassau, New Providence Island, the Bahamas, and the wedding was still in motion when something in the water changed the tone of everything happening on shore. Crispin Aldemar Voss, 31, was an HVAC technician from Asheville, North Carolina. He worked steadily, avoided attention, and followed routines. The destination wedding had been Britta's vision, and he had agreed without resistance. Britta Celine Haverkamp, 29, a dental hygienist, had spent nearly 2 years organizing the event. The photographer, Tomasz Wirecki, a Miami-based freelancer, suggested a final photo set in shallow water at sunset for lighting conditions. The resort allowed beach access without restriction. From the research I did, this kind of unrestricted shoreline access at resort properties in the Bahamas is pretty standard, and that context matters for what unfolds here. The shoreline was part of a managed coastal cove with clear, shallow water that gradually deepened into sand channels. This region is part of a wider Bahamian marine ecosystem, where coastal shark species occasionally move through reef edges, sand flats, and nearshore feeding areas while following prey movement patterns. The water was calm at the surface, with only light wave action breaking over the sandbar. Visibility was moderate, but reduced near the bottom due to stirred sediment from earlier movement in the shallows. Several guests were still waiting nearby, adding minor surface disturbance, while the couple remained stationary for photos as the photographer adjusted position closer to the waterline. Crispin stepped into chest-deep water. Britta followed, her dress floating in the current. Guests watched from the shoreline as the final poses were set. The incident occurred suddenly. Crispin's body shifted as an unseen force from below disrupted his balance and pulled him partially underwater. The movement was abrupt enough that nearby guests initially interpreted it as a slip or loss of footing in uneven sand. He resurfaced disoriented, displacing water and struggling to orient himself before attempting to regain balance. A shark was briefly observed in close proximity in shallow water. Based on regional species presence and post-incident marine review, the most likely species involved was a bull shark, a coastal species documented in Bahamian nearshore environments and associated with severe bite incidents in shallow surf zones. Species identification could not be confirmed at the time of the incident. The interaction was consistent with a short bite and release event, a behavior documented in some coastal shark species where unfamiliar surface activity or rapid movement can trigger investigative contact rather than sustained predation. Immediately after the first contact, Crispin attempted to move toward shore but lost structural stability in the water due to injury, wave motion, and uneven footing within the sand channel. The resulting splashing and irregular movement were followed within seconds by additional close-range contact to the same lower limb, producing a more forceful injury and rapid escalation of tissue and vascular damage. Crispin remained conscious as Britta reached him. Several guests entered the water to assist, while others called for emergency help. The photographer moved toward shore as the situation escalated. Crispin was brought into shallower water by bystanders. He remained conscious for a short period, but showed rapid signs of severe blood loss from the lower body. His ability to stand collapsed as hemorrhage progressed. Britta was right there. I keep coming back to that. She was right there, and there was nothing she could do to change what was already happening. Emergency services arrived shortly after dispatch and performed hemorrhage control on scene, including a tourniquet, before rapid transport. He was airlifted to a hospital in Nassau for surgery, but died later that day from exsanguination due to severe lower limb vascular injury. Authorities classified it as a fatal marine injury during recreational shoreline activity. With no direct visual confirmation or recovered animal, the exact sequence and species could not be confirmed, though regional reviews suggested a likely interaction with a coastal bull shark. Limited footage briefly circulated before removal. The resort conducted an internal review and issued no public findings beyond standard reporting. Britta returned home days later, and the photographer left wedding work. No further statements were made. I know these kinds of incidents are rare, but they can still happen in coastal areas where humans and nearshore sharks overlap. I understand that awareness and caution in low visibility water can reduce risk, but it can't be fully eliminated. It was September 16, 2018, Gallatin National Forest, Montana. A canyon trail running through dense brush with rock walls rising on both sides. The terrain funneled movement in one direction and limited visibility to a short stretch ahead. Sound carried differently in the canyon depending on the wind. It was a known grizzly bear country, and both hikers knew that before they started. Aaron Whitfield was 39. He worked as a structural engineer for a firm in Bozeman and had been hiking seriously since his early 20s. He had introduced Jess to trail hiking not long after they met, and over the years she had grown comfortable on most terrain, though she still deferred to him on route decisions and gear. They had been married for 11 years. Their youngest daughter had just left for boarding school the previous month, the last of their children to go, and the house had been quieter than either of them had expected. The trip had been Aaron's suggestion, just the two of them, the way things had been before the children came. Jess had agreed without hesitation. Their youngest had just left for boarding school. The house was quiet for the first time in years. Aaron suggested the trip, and Jess agreed without hesitation. I keep thinking about how normal that sounds, how ordinary the reason for going was. Jess Whitfield was also 39. She worked as a practice manager at a dental clinic in Bozeman. Hiking was not something she had grown up with. Aaron had brought her into it gradually, and she had come to enjoy it, particularly the longer canyon routes, where the terrain felt dramatic without being technical. She trusted his judgment on the trail the way she trusted it most places. They had come prepared. Bear spray was clipped to both hip holsters with the safety tabs already removed. They were moving at a controlled pace and making regular noise as they walked. Everything about their approach to the trail was correct. The grizzly appeared ahead of them at roughly 60 meters. Both hikers stopped immediately. They stood together, spoke in calm, steady voices, and held the spray at low ready. The bear was watching them and beginning to close the distance slowly. They held their position and kept talking. The bear continued to approach. As the distance came down to around 30 meters, Aaron shifted slightly forward. The adjustment placed him closer to the bear than Jess. He was now the nearest point of contact. The bear closed the remaining distance rapidly. Aaron deployed the spray. The cloud caught the edge of the approach and disrupted the bear's focus, but not enough to stop the charge at that distance. The bear reached Aaron. It bit into his upper back and neck and pinned him under its weight, maintaining contact through repeated force. The injuries were severe and rapidly incapacitating. A ranger already in the canyon corridor, moving through the trail system after recent bear activity reports in the area, changed direction when human voices shifted from routine noise to distress. Coming into a position. With sightlines to the trail, the ranger deployed bear spray from a distance that allowed the cloud to form fully. The secondary spray cloud reached effective concentration across the trail before the bear could re-engage with Jess. The bear disengaged and redirected away from her and out of the immediate area. The ranger got on the radio immediately and called for additional personnel and emergency medical response. Jess was kept back while the ranger moved toward Aaron. He was on the ground in the encounter zone, unresponsive, with severe injuries to his neck and upper back. The ranger attempted to control the bleeding as best as the injury location allowed and maintained that until additional personnel arrived. Paramedics were dispatched, but the canyon location added time to the response. By the time medical support reached the scene, Aaron Whitfield had lost too much blood. He was pronounced dead at the site. He was 39 years old. Jess was uninjured. Post-incident review noted that both hikers had followed correct bear encounter protocol from the initial sighting. It was July 27th, 2017, at a Tidal Creek camp in the Sundarbans Delta, India, where huts stood on raised platforms linked by wooden boardwalks, and the mangrove forest began roughly 3 meters from the perimeter. Guests were briefed on arrival. No leaving the boardwalk alone, no movement before sunrise. Martin Ellsworth was 58 and worked as a commercial property developer in Bristol. He and his wife Caroline had been drifting for years, the marriage reduced to routine and distance. She had proposed the trip in an attempt to repair things. He had agreed after initial resistance, and they cleared a week to travel together. They were 4 days into the stay, with a small group, and the trip had not shifted the dynamic between them. The tension had followed them into the camp. In the early hours of July 27th, before dawn, Caroline looked at Martin's phone and found messages from his personal assistant. The exchange was clear enough. The argument that followed stayed quiet, contained within the hut while others slept. Martin did not deny it directly. The conversation ended without resolution. She brought him to the Sundarbans to save her marriage. I want you to hold on to that before we go any further. At approximately 5:15 a.m., in low light before sunrise, Martin took his cigarettes and left the hut without speaking. He had used the boardwalk alone during the day on previous occasions, and once stepped briefly off the end without consequence. The space within the perimeter had begun to feel controlled. He walked the length of the boardwalk and stepped off at the far end. Beyond it, the ground shifted to tidal mud, interlaced with mangrove roots. Visibility dropped within a few steps. Sound was dampened by the density of the vegetation. He moved several meters into the margin at the tree line. Bengal tigers in the Sundarbans use these root systems as movement corridors. holding position close to the boundary between open ground and forest. A tiger was already there, within close range before Martin entered the space. The encounter was not pursuit, it was overlap. The strike came from the left, fast and without warning. Contact was made at the neck and upper shoulder, and the force carried him into the roots. The tiger repositioned him further into the tree line and dragged him several meters toward cover before disengaging. Guests in nearby huts heard a single heavy impact, a brief disturbance in the roots, and then silence. Torches came on. People moved to the edge of the boardwalk, but did not enter the tree line. By then, the tiger had already withdrawn into the mangroves. Rangers were contacted, and a recovery team entered after first light, once the area was assessed for movement. Martin was located approximately 6 to 8 meters inside the tree line, near a dense root cluster. The injuries were non-survivable at the point of contact. His body was transported to the nearest ranger station, where Caroline identified him. The post-incident review confirmed he had left the boardwalk before sunrise against explicit instruction. The presence of the tiger at that location was consistent with normal movement patterns along the creek edge. No action was taken against the animal. The camp boundary ended at the boardwalk. He moved beyond it.